a Google Classroom assignment. So hopefully you've already seen your score or have it available. Once you see your test, if you have questions, ask me after. I moved the roll sheet inside because we had an instance the other day of somebody signing the sheet and then leaving and never actually coming to class. And so I've moved it inside so that if you're going to do that, you have to come in and look at me to do it and make it a little more obvious. So it's up here on this right side, to your right, this pedestal over here. If you haven't signed it on the way in, make sure you get it on the way out. Yeah, I think that's it. I think that's all of the.
We're going to get through all of them today.
Yep, whole book. Do the whole book. And in the last class, I finished about 5 minutes early, so, maybe. It'll happen once or twice this semester that I'll finish early instead of late. But I think that's all the housekeeping stuff, so let's get into the book of Numbers. As we've seen so far, we finished up the last book, Leviticus, and as we saw going into Leviticus, the book of Exodus ended with this problem. Even though they had built the tabernacle, they built this place for God's presence to dwell and for the people to be able to come and be in God's presence, there was an issue and nobody could actually come in when God's presence was there. Moses himself couldn't come into the presence of God in the tabernacle. And so the book of Leviticus gives us the system of sacrifices and the Levitical laws, everything that regulates the worship in the tabernacle, and gives also instructions and various commands for moral living as the people of God. And so this whole Levitical system is given to them, and they begin the process of sacrifices, and they begin making sacrifices, and now they can enter into God's presence. And the book of Numbers begins with God speaking to Moses in the tent of meeting. And so Moses is now able to enter into the tent and speak to God directly. So it's up there. Get it at the end of class. Wait inside at the end of class. So the people, Moses is speaking to God inside the tent of meeting, and God gives him some more instructions. And this time around, the instructions are for how to organize the camp. And so now they've got the tabernacle figured out and the system of sacrifices and all the laws for the tabernacle figured out in Leviticus. Now God is going to give them instructions for how to organize the camp. And the camp is organized in a particular way so that different tribes have a particular side that they're supposed to encamp on. And so you have the tribe of Judah is the leading tribe to the east, and I've got somebody taking a test over there, so I'm not going to say all the tribe names, but all of the remaining tribes are arranged around the tabernacle, except for in the very center you have the tribe of Levi. Yes, ma'am. When I did that was a chiasmus. That was the literary structure for. No, this is my diagram for how the camp of Israel was arranged. This is just a visual to help you imagine how it's happening. I don't expect you to remember which tribes are in which place or anything. Judah goes first, and then Levi is encamped immediately around the tabernacle. But that means if you count, you got 3 tribes in to the east in front, and you got 3 tribes to the west, 3 to the south, 3 to the north, and then 1 around the camp. Do the math, that's 13, right? 13 tribes. But we normally talk about it, we normally talk about it as though there are 12 tribes of Israel. And so there's some kind of curiosity or confusion about what's going on here. The tribe of Levi is set apart specifically to serve God and to serve in the tabernacle and then later in the temple, and to carry the tabernacle from place to place. Various families of the tribe of Levi are to be the ones to break down the tabernacle and to be the ones that carry it to the next place and then to set it up again. And so the tribe of Levi is dedicated more specifically to God than the rest. And then you have the 2 tribes at the very back of the camp is Ephraim and Manasseh, which are the 2 sons of Joseph rather than the sons of Jacob. And so you actually end up with 13 tribes, but these 2, Ephraim and Manasseh, are sometimes called half-tribes instead of being referred to as tribes, and so people still talk about them as though there are 12 tribes of Israel, even though there are 13 tribe names. And that can get a little confusing. Just just note that it is, and the history behind that is kind of complex and not worth going into for an intro class. But there are 13 tribe names, but people often talk about the 12 tribes of Israel. And so the 12 tribes arrange themselves around the tabernacle, and this was intended to be a kind of embodied, symbolic representation of their life as the people of God. All of the tribes, all of the people of Israel are arranged around the tabernacle, and so the presence of God and the worship of God is literally in the center of the people. It's central to the people. It's central to who they are as Israel. And so their encampment embodies, it becomes a kind of living symbol of the fact that they're supposed to be centered around God. That everything is supposed to come out of that, being centered on God. And so God and the representation or the place of God's presence is in the very center of the camp, and everything else is arranged around that. And so God gives instructions for the arrangement of the people, the arrangement of the tribes around the ark, or around the tabernacle, which contains the ark. And that's how they're set up. And then God also gives instructions for when they're supposed to move and how they're supposed to break down and move. And for when they're supposed to move and encamp, the rules are really easy. There's this giant pillar of cloud by day and pillar of fire by night. And if it goes in front of the people and is moving, you follow it. And if it stops and rests over the tabernacle, you stop and you camp until it moves again. And so for as long as the cloud stays over the tabernacle, you stay encamped and you stay right there. Whether it's a day or a month that you're encamped right here without moving, you stay until the pillar moves. And then when the pillar moves, you get up in the morning and the pillar is not over the tabernacle, it is somewhere else. You get up, you break camp, and you follow it. You go toward it. And that's how they're led. That's how the people of Israel know where they're supposed to go and when they're supposed to get up and leave. And then there's some instructions for how the Levites and which clans or which families in the Levites are supposed to do what in the breaking down and then the carrying and then the setting up and all of that stuff for the tabernacle. And then there's a couple of other miscellaneous rules and laws given. But the reason that this is called the Book of Numbers is actually because the Book of Numbers, one of the first things in the Book of Numbers is a census. There is this huge census. God tells Moses when he goes into the tent meeting, he tells him to take a census of all of Israel and to count the number of men over the age of 20 in the camps, so that they will know how many men they have of fighting age. So they take this census and they count all the men that are age 20 and older that are of age to fight, and they come up with about 600,000. Of course, they don't just count them and record that there are 600,000. The Book of Numbers records the number in each tribe and the number each clan, within each clan within each tribe, and that takes up several chapters, which is actually why Numbers is a relatively unread and unknown book. I hear people all the time, as a pastor, people decide that they're going to make their New Year's resolution or the thing that they're going to try to do, they're going to read the whole Bible through from beginning to end. And they start out great, they read Genesis, and there's a couple of places where they kind of get bogged down a little bit, but overall they do really well. They read through Genesis, they get into Exodus. The story is strange in moments, but very moving, and you know, until they get to the latter part with all the instructions of the tabernacle, and that gets a little rocky. But they usually get through Exodus, and then they'll get to Leviticus, and they get a little lost in what in the world is going on, what's with all these rules. And probably about half quit during Leviticus and never get to Numbers, and then the other half, probably 2/3, when they start reading Numbers and they get to the census and they get like 2 or 3 chapters of just the numbers of the people in the camp, they kind of lose it and stop. And so most people, when if they make the commitment, I'm going to read all the way through the Bible, they start with the Old Testament, they start with Genesis, and they start reading, and they get to Numbers if they make it that far, and they get to the census and they lose it. They don't want to read no more. And so I can't tell you how many people I have talked to that have said, yeah, I'm going to read the whole Bible through, and then that's their story. They get to Leviticus or Numbers and they can't take it no more, and they stop. If that's ever been you, don't get discouraged. Just, skip over the Numbers part to the census part. It's not the whole book, it's just the very beginning. But the reason it's called Numbers is because it's the numbers of the tribes of Israel at the very beginning of the book. The first thing is they're commanded to take a census, and they do. And so they take the census and they find out that there's about 600,000 men of fighting age among them. And that is part of where we get the number for the total tribe, the total mass of the camp of Israel being around 1 million or more. If you've got 600,000 men over the age of 20 that are in fighting shape, then you've got a whole lot more than that by the time you count in women and children and potentially men that are too old to fight. And so there's probably at least 1 million, maybe double the 600,000 number or more. There could be upwards of 2 million people in the camp. And so it's not real clear how many total, but the census taken shows 600,000 fighting men. And that gives us a basis to kind of extrapolate or guess from there. And so there's 600,000 fighting men and then all the rest, and they have been given instructions for how to arrange the camp. And in chapter 9, after I gave you the very first passage in chapter 1 to read, and then I skipped you ahead to chapter 9 so that you skipped all the census part. You're welcome. And you come to the census part, you skip all the census part, and the next thing I had you read was God telling them to celebrate the Passover. And so the next year, a full year has gone around now. It's a year later, year after the escape from Egypt and the 10th plague. And it's time again, it's the first month of the year, and it's time to celebrate the Passover again. And so God tells them to celebrate the Passover, right? They do, they celebrate the first Passover. And then about a month later, during the second month of that year, God tells them to break camp, and the pillar of cloud gets up and goes, and they break camp and follow it. And they begin to travel again for the first time. And so they have been at Mount Sinai now for several months, about 9 months most likely. So the time from Egypt or from the Red Sea to Mount Sinai was about 3 months, and now they've just celebrated the Passover a year later, and it's about a month after that. So they're 9 to 10 months they have spent at Mount Sinai with the construction of the tabernacle and then getting further instructions and now celebrating the Passover, and now they're ready to break and start moving. And so they start traveling, and as they travel, they start having issues crop up. Not with things that they really genuinely don't have, but just they start complaining and grumbling again, like they did in Exodus as they just got out of Egypt. And so one issue that crops up is that the people start complaining and griping that they're getting the same food every day. This miraculous bread, this manna that keeps cropping up and appearing on the ground, they're tired of eating it, even though it's extremely good tasting. They're tired of eating the same bread every day. And so they complain, and God had been sending quail in the evenings, or at least from time to time in the evenings, and they start complaining and grumbling and griping and talking about the fish that they had in Egypt that was so good and they could eat all they wanted. And so God says, you want meat? Fine, you can have meat. I'll send quail. And then this is where God says you will have it not for 1 day or not for 2 days or not for 10 days. You'll have it for a solid month until it's coming out of your nose and you can't stand the sight of it. And so they get quail. And God gives it to them. And also there is a plague that breaks out. And so there is this judgment, this punishment that comes for their grumbling and complaining, even though God does provide for them. And then a little later, there is an issue where actually Moses' family starts to grumble about him and complain about him. And Aaron and Miriam, his brother-in-law and sister, start complaining or muttering about his choice of a wife. He married, if you remember back in Exodus, he married Zipporah, and we're told in Numbers that Zipporah, her family was Cushite. They were from Cush, and the Cushites, well, they're not Israelites, and that's the major complaint. They are not from the people of Israel. Turns out that if you look into it, the Cushites are a family or a people from Africa, and they were known for having very dark skin and very red hair. That's red hair and dark skin. And so this woman is from Zipporah. She's a Cushite. She's not an Israelite. And Moses should have married an Israelite if he wants to lead the people of Israel. And so they start grumbling and complaining. And so God deals with Aaron and Miriam, in fact, gets leprosy until Moses prays for her, and then God heals her. And so there's all this grumbling and complaining and things that are happening in camp as they travel. And here they are, they literally just left the mountain where they saw God's presence on the mountain, thunders and rumblings and all that. This is the same people that, a year ago were still in slavery in Egypt and have just been let out. I mean, it's the same people, but they're grumbling and complaining about everything and are getting restless and rebellious. Well, about half the way, they're traveling from Mount Sinai up to where Israel is today, to the eastern edge of the Mediterranean. And they're traveling, they're going, and they get about halfway there, and they come to this particular mountain, and God tells them to stop and tells Moses to have each of the tribes select a representative to go and spy out the land ahead of them. And so each of the 12 tribes choose a representative and send one representative each, and this group of men go ahead into the land to spy it out. And Moses tells them specifically to look for how well fortified they are, how big their armies are, and how strong the people are. If the cities have walls, if they're fortified cities, or if they're just open cities, which by the way is like a major determinant in how secure a city is in the ancient world. Walls don't really work so well now because we have artillery and all kinds of other things that just drop explosives over the walls, and your walls don't do much. But in the ancient world, without all that, a wall was like the major source of security for a town. If you had a walled city, a city with a wall around it, then just a few warriors or a few soldiers could protect that city against a much larger army attacking, because they had the height advantage for shooting and they had narrow openings that they could defend rather than having to defend every open street. And so if a city had a wall around it, that was a major deal. And so Moses says, go in and check and see, are the cities fortified? Are they walled cities, or are they just open? How strong are the people? See how good the land is. Is it fertile? Does it produce good crops? And if you can, bring back some of the produce of the land. If the timing works, and bring back some of the produce of the land. And so these 12 spies go out and they start traveling ahead of the camp, and they're going at their best speed, and the rest of the camp, over 1 million, is traveling at the pace that over 1 million can. And so they get ahead pretty fast, and they go and they spend about 40 days in Canaan, in the promised land, looking at everything that they can see, finding out what they can find out, and then they come back and they report to the people. And the report is that sure enough, it's a fantastic land. It's very bountiful. It's a land flowing with milk and honey, as they describe it as. And there's plenty there. There's plenty of food. The land is great. But 10 of the 12 spies also come back complaining and afraid of the people and the fortifications. And they say the cities have walls, and they are strong and tall walls. We won't be able to breach them. The people, the warriors there, are strong and intimidating. In fact, they say that some of them they are descended from the Nephilim, which are mentioned in Genesis as being these warlike great warriors of renown, and they're kind of associated with giants, and so they're huge. And so they say that the people of the land are so big they make us feel like grasshoppers in front of them. And so they're strong, they're powerful, they have these fortified cities, and basically their conclusion is there is no way that we are going and attacking this place and winning. If we go in there, we're going to get slaughtered. And so we can't go in. And so these 10 spies stir up the whole camp of Israel into fear and terror about what might happen, and the people refuse to go in. But 2 of the spies, Joshua and Caleb, these 2 guys say, look, yes, the cities are fortified. Yes, the people are strong and look intimidating, but none of that matters. God is going with us. God is going in front of us. If God wants us to have the land, he'll give us the land. It doesn't matter who or how strong they are. God will give it to us. So trust him and go. This would make abundant sense if you remember, who they are. That the idea of going and going into a land that's already occupied by very strong, very warlike, very well fortified people with much better weapons than yours should sound terrifying, right? That sounds like a terrible idea. But remember who those people are. They were in slavery, a year and a half ago. And without raising a weapon, God brought them out of slavery through a sea on dry ground, wiped out an entire army right in front of them, and then gave them victory over another tribe with the stolen or the looted weapons from the army that just got drowned behind them. Did all of this without them having to do anything. I mean, God has given them this victory. They have seen God do all this. And then there was Mount Sinai with the thunder and the rumbling and the everything God did there. So they have seen God doing these things. They should know that they can trust God. If God tells them to do it, they should do it. But they look at the land and they look how well fortified it is, or the report of the spies anyway, that how strong the people are, and they are terrified and they refuse to go. They say, we won't go. Let's appoint a new leader, replace Moses. We're going to get rid of Moses, appoint somebody else that can take us back to Egypt. And we'll go back to Egypt. It was better there than to die here. That seems to be their statement about almost everything. It's better to go back to Egypt than to die here because of whatever they're grumbling about today. And so they say, we're not going. We can't go. There's no way we can win this. This was a terrible idea, Moses. Why did you lead us here? This was awful. And they're so convinced that it's such a terrible idea that they want to stone Joshua and Caleb. They want to kill them by throwing stones at them until they die. That's what stoning is, if you're not familiar with the concept. That they want to stone Joshua and Caleb for suggesting that they should go in. And they want to replace Moses with someone else. And so God shows up more powerfully than before, and his glory is there, and Moses and Aaron come to the tent of meeting to speak with God, and God basically says, they're not going. They're not going to go into the promised land. Fine. They're not allowed to go into the promised land. They're worried about their children being taken captives and used as slaves. I'm going to give the land to their children, but not to them. And so God tells them for the next 40 years, for 1 year for each day that they spied out the land, I'm going to cause them to wander in the wilderness. And they will wander, and in that time, all of those who refused to go into the land, who saw the miracles that I performed in Egypt and saw what I had done for them, who've seen everything that I've done since the beginning, but still refuse to trust me, they will die and be buried in the desert, and their children will go into the land. And so he's going to give the land to the children. He says that the only exceptions are Joshua and Caleb, these two spies that trusted and were willing to go. And so they'll be able to live, and they'll be able to go into the promised land. But the rest of these people, the rest of the census that was taken for men 20 and older that were able to fight, that had seen all the miracles and seen all that God had done, they'll die in the desert, and they're not going in.
So the walls of the city that they're talking about, eventually the walls that Joshua will fall down.
One of
like
them.
the walls of Jericho.
Yeah, Jericho. The Jericho isn't specifically mentioned in the spying out the land, but it's just one example of the many fortified cities that they found. That's what they're seeing.
So like the ones that they march around and all fall down.
Yeah, that'll be. We'll get to that next week. It's Monday and maybe Tuesday, depending on how long we need to do Joshua. But that's these people are going to wander in the desert and wander in the wilderness until this generation dies off because of their refusal to trust them. Well, when some of them hear that, they say, well, okay, we messed up. We goofed. We should have agreed to go in. We're sorry. We'll go now. And so they get up a good number, and they get up a bunch of guys to go fight, and they get ready to leave, and Moses comes to them and says, guys, God's not going with you. God's already said what was going to happen. You refuse to trust him. He's not going with you. You can't undo it now. But they don't listen to Moses, and they say, yeah, we're going to go. We'll go and fight. We'll show God that we trust him, and we're going to go. And so they go, and Moses doesn't go with them, and the ark doesn't go before them. And they go, and they fight, and they get trounced. The people of the land just beat them senseless, kill a bunch of them, and they had to flee, and they retreat for miles and miles before they're able to break away. And so, I mean, God's punishment or God's command on them, what God said is going to happen, is clear. They're going to wander in the desert for 40 years. And what's interesting is that later we find out, and if you look in Deuteronomy, which we'll be looking at on Friday, we're told specifically that they didn't get new shoes, they didn't get new clothing during this 40 years in the wilderness. I mean, I'm wearing a pair of shoes that's 2 to 3 years, 2 years old now maybe, and I can feel the bottoms coming out of them, right? It's like I can feel the soles wearing through. Shoes don't last that long, even when you're standing still relatively, much less walking most days and covering miles and miles and miles a day. But their shoes never wore out. Their clothing never wore out. They always had food. God provided the food and water that they needed. Their tents held up. They always had what they needed, in spite of the fact that they were being punished for their lack of trust, their lack of faith. And so even though God has given them this fairly strong consequence for their lack of trust, God doesn't abandon them, and they still get what they need. And God still provides for them. But the people they start traveling and they start walking, and God leads them, and they end up kind of going around in this kind of meandering path that nobody's real sure how to trace. It's just kind of wandering without a specific end in mind over the next 40 years, all over the Sinai Peninsula and around. And so they just wander for this 40 years. And during that 40 years, lots of other situations crop up. There's lots of other issues, lots of other moments where somebody's grumbling and there's a consequence, or where a whole group of people tries to rebel against Moses or to rebel against God, and there's consequences. And in one case, I don't expect you guys to know this name later, just to give you a visual to know who I'm talking about. There's a guy named Korah, and he is a Levite. And he's descended from this tribe that is supposed to be encamped around the middle, it's supposed to be servants of God. But he's not a descendant of Aaron, and descendants of Aaron's are the priests. Only Aaron is the priest, and his sons, and then descendants from Aaron from then on. Only descendants of Aaron can be priests. But we have the descendants of Levi, and they have particular jobs there around the tabernacle. But there's this Levite named Korah who gets it into his head that because all of the people are the people of God, they are all holy, there's no need for Moses or Aaron to lead them. They can all be priests, they can all do what they want to do, and there's no reason to obey Moses. And so Moses doesn't actually directly oppose Korah, but God speaks to Moses and tells him what to do. He tells him to have Korah and all of those who are with him, all those who believe like he does, and all those who are following him, to come and bring their censers, bring bronze censers. And censers are the pots, basically, that they would burn incense in. To bring censers and appear before the tabernacle, appear before the Lord the next day. And then there's these two other guys that are from the tribe of Reuben, the very southernmost tribe. They're from the tribe of Reuben. There's these two other guys that are just raising issues and conflicts for Moses, and they're opposing Moses. And when Moses calls an assembly, they refuse even to come out. When God calls for the entire nation of Israel to assemble for some reason, they won't even come out of their tents. And so they're opposing Moses and causing all kinds of conflicts and issues for him. And so the next day, God tells Moses to go out to these two Reubenite guys, to their camp, and speak to them. And God gives Moses what to say. And so Moses tells them, that you think that you are separate from Israel, that you don't have to follow the one that God appoints. If these families, if these people, these two men and all of their camp, all of their families, if they die a natural death, let that be a sign that I am not the one that God has chosen. I am not the leader that God has chosen. I do not speak for God. But if I am the one that God has chosen, and I am the one that God has chosen to lead this people, to speak for him, then let the ground open up underneath them, and they and all that they have go alive into the realm of the dead. So basically let them be buried alive. And as soon as Moses stops speaking, the crevices open up in the ground, the earth opens up, and they and all that they have falls into the earth and is covered over. And so they go alive into the realm of the dead. They fall down into the earth. And so those people dealt with. Then Moses goes back to the tabernacle, to where Korah and his 250 Levites, who think that they can be more than Levites and they should be priests, and that everybody should have the right to say what they want and do as they wish, and all go into the temple. Goes back to Korah and his followers, and they're all there, and God says, "You think that you should be priests? Light your fires, put your incense on it, come and offer it to me before the Lord. Come in and offer it." And they put their censers on their coals, or the incense on their coals and their censers, and fire comes out from the altar and burns them all. Fire comes from God, and they're all burned to a crisp. And so you end up with these, just my mental image is piles of ashes with a bronze censer sitting in the middle of it. Because God then tells Aaron to go and collect all those bronze censers, because they were used to offer incense to the Lord. They're now holy. They're now set apart for God. And so take them and beat them out into sheets and put them around, use them to sheathe the altar, and put them around the outside of the altar as a reminder to all future generations not to do what they did, basically. Not to think that you can take over and form. The deal here, I think what happened with Korah and his followers is, we talked the other day about the idea of holiness, that holiness means being set apart to God. being set apart for God. And the followers of Korah came to understand that the people of Israel were holy, and they thought that that meant that there was something in them that was special and better than anybody else, and so they were qualified to make decisions about what was right and wrong and how they should worship and to be able to do basically whatever they thought was right. Because if they're holy, whatever they think is right must be right. And so they thought, we don't have to follow this Moses guy. We're all holy, so we can all do what we think best. And they missed the part where holiness is not a quality that you have. It's about your relationship with God. It's being set apart for God, set apart for God's purposes. And they thought that the holiness was in them and not in their relationship. And so that when they decided that they could do whatever they wanted, they weren't in that relationship anymore. They thought that the holiness was a quality they had and not a quality that God had and shared with them. And that led to their rebellion, and they basically wanted to make their own rules and branch off and make their own religion, more or less. And that's why they get the rather severe consequence of just being immediately immolated and burned to death. So there's this instance, and then there's a later issue where there's more grumbling, more complaining, more rebellion, and so God sends this plague of poisonous serpents. And so these poisonous snakes come into the camp and start biting people, and people start dying. And they cry out to God and cry out to Moses, asking to pray for them. Moses prays for the people, and God tells Moses to take a pole and fashion a serpent out of bronze, like the serpents that are biting people. Fashion a serpent out of bronze and lift it up on that pole, and anyone that looks at the pole after they've been bitten, anyone that looks at the serpent will be healed. And instead of dying from the venom, they'll survive. And so he does, and anyone that looks at the pole lives, and anyone who doesn't dies. This is probably one of the better known stories in Numbers, the Moses and the bronze serpent. There's also, Joshua and Caleb are relatively well known. You probably know people with those names because of this situation. Joshua also, of course, is the next, the first book of the Bible after the Torah is done. So there's a couple of stories that are fairly well known, but the story of Moses and the bronze serpent is fairly well known because Jesus refers to it in one of the best known passages in the New Testament. Most of you have probably heard some part of or might be able to recite to me John 3:16. For God so loved the world that he gave his one and only Son, that whoever believes in him should not perish but have everlasting life. That is kind of the very end of a conversation Jesus is having with a religious leader, a Pharisee named Nicodemus. And in that conversation, Jesus makes a reference back to this bronze serpent and makes a connection to himself with it. He says, just as Moses raised up the serpent in the wilderness, so when the Son of Man, when I am lifted up, I will draw all people to myself. And so Jesus makes a connection between himself and this bronze serpent, and so that story ends up being fairly well known, even though it's a little bit odd to be bitten by snakes, and then to take one of those snakes and an image of that snake and lift it up and looking at it heals you. It's a little odd. So there's several, we've hit several. There are several stories of the rebellion of the Israelites, and they're grumbling and they're complaining, and they're not being willing to trust and to follow God, and the consequences that come from it all through the book of Numbers. In fact, there's a long segment in here that seems to be what the story's about. And then we get this change. God tells Moses to take another census, and we're getting late into the 40 years. A lot of the previous generation has died off. God tells Moses to take another census to count this younger generation now of men that are of the age to be able to fight. And they take another census, find out how many fighting men there are, and they're starting to work their way towards the promised land to go into it as God's promised them. And actually, before we get there is one more story that I didn't tell you about this wandering in the wilderness period. There's an instance where the people they no longer have water. They've run out of water, and there's no water available to them. And so once again, as before, Moses goes to talk to God to find out what to do to produce water, to get water for the people. But this time around, I guess he's had it up to here with them, and he hadn't got the patience. And God tells him to take the staff and to go and stand before the people and speak to this rock, and it will give water. It will pour out water for them. And Moses, in his anger, frustration, or whatever reason, whatever his issue was this day, instead of speaking to the rock as he was commanded, he does what he did before, and he strikes the rock. And he says, before he strikes it, he says to the people, this is, you stiff-necked, stubborn people, how long should I have to put up with you? Shall we, talking about he and Aaron, shall we give you water from this rock? Shall we bring forth water from this rock? And then he strikes it, and then he strikes it again, and on the second strike, water comes out. But that wasn't what God told him to do. And when he's talking to the people, he's angry at them, and he says, shall we give you water from this rock? Like, go try to strike a rock sometime, see how much water comes out. It's like, obviously this was never them giving the water. But Moses, in his anger and his frustration, he loses it, and he does not even acknowledge that God is the one that gives the water. He claims the honor for himself. And he disobeys God. He doesn't do what God tells him to do. Instead of speaking to the rock, he strikes it twice. And so God gives the water, but then afterwards God tells Moses, because you have rebelled against me and you've not given me honor you've not honored me in front of the people, you'll suffer the same fate that they do. You will not lead this people into the promised land. You will come to a mountain and you will look at the promised land, you will see the promised land, but you will die there on the mountain and not lead the people in. And so Moses rebels against God in his frustration and anger or whatever else he was experiencing that day, and he rebels against God, disobeys God in front of the entire assembly, and suffers the consequences. He's going to die rather than lead the people in. And then after all of that we have this aside. The people are coming, they're moving towards the promised land, the 40 years is over, they've taken another census, and they're coming up on the land of peoples near the promised land. And they end up having to fight some battles, and they win, and they end up taking some territory and claiming it on the other side, outside of Canaan, outside of the promised land, on the east side of the Jordan River. And so they end up taking some of this land, and they're coming into the land of the Moabites. Again, I don't expect you to remember, specifically what land they're coming into, but they're coming into the land of the Moabites. And the king of Moab is afraid that if this massive group of people, million strong, comes wandering through his territory, they're going to take everything that they can find and consume it all. There's not going to be enough animals and enough produce in the whole land to feed them, and they're just going to take everything, waste everything in Moab. And so he decides that Moab is going to go out and fight against them and run them off and make them go around and not be able to come through the land. And so he's apparently still a little worried about the way this is going to go, and so he decides that the thing to do is to go and hire a prophet to curse them. And so he goes and tries to find somebody, kind of a mystical guy, a prophet, to curse the people of Israel so that they will have victory over them in battle. And so the guy he chooses is named Balaam. And so he sends messengers to Balaam and says, come and prophesy against and pronounce curses on these people of Israel, and I'll give you this great reward. You'll have money to spare. I'll give you this great big reward. And at first Balaam refuses to come, but eventually the messengers and the king are pretty insistent, and so he comes on. And so he saddles up, he gets on his donkey, and starts to ride out to go. And he gets some ways down the road, going towards the king of Moab, meet up with him, and all of a sudden his donkey just stops listening to him, won't go where he tells him to go, and just wanders off the road and munches on the grass and just acts generally stubborn, and then comes back to the road and goes on. And then a little while later, the same thing happens. They come to this kind of a narrow spot in the road, and instead of going on down the road, donkey just turns off and goes meandering along the side of the road and refuses to go on, and eventually kind of meanders around and gets back on the road and keeps on going. And then finally, a third time, they come to this narrow place, and there's really nowhere for the donkey to get off the road, and so the donkey just stops. And Balaam is fed up with his donkey at this point, so he just starts wailing on him, beating him to try to get him to go, to move on down the road. And then all of a sudden the donkey turns around and talks to him and says, "Why are you beating me? Why would you be beating me? Have I ever done this kind of thing before? Have I ever just refused to go where you wanted me to go before? This is not like a regular thing. Do you think I might have a reason for it?" Kind of my paraphrase of the conversation. And Balaam says, you have embarrassed me, you've shamed me by not listening to me. He's just ticked off at you. You've shamed me. And then God causes Balaam's eyes to be open so that he can see what the donkey had seen. And there in the road in front of him, in this narrow place, is this angel standing with a bared sword. And the angel says, "You really shouldn't have been beating your donkey. He saved your life 3 times today. 3 times now I've been standing in the road in front of you to oppose you going to the king of the Moabites. And if your donkey had come on through, I would have killed you and spared him. But instead he turned off and stopped, and he has saved your life today." And Balaam has probably had about enough of weirdness for the day, and so he says, "If you don't want me to go, I'll just go back home. Yeah. This isn't worth it. I'll just go home." And the angel says, "No, go to the king, but make sure that you don't say anything that God doesn't tell you to. Speak no word that is not from God." And so Balaam gets back on his donkey, and he goes on down the road, and he gets to the king of Moab, and the king of Moab is a little ticked at him for taking so long to get there, but he says, "Go out and curse this people, go and pronounce prophecy over these people, curse this people, and I will reward you." And Balaam warns him, he says, "I cannot say anything except what God tells me. I can't say whatever I want, I must say whatever God tells me to say." And so they go up to a mountaintop, and they're overlooking the camp of Israel. They can see down, and they're seeing this camp spread out in front of them. And while they're there up on the mountaintop, Balaam opens his mouth to speak over them and to try to curse them, but nothing but blessing will come out. Nothing but good things about them and their prosperity and how God is going to give them victory comes out. So that all that he can say about them is good. And he stops and backs up, and the king of Moab is displeased with the blessing rather than the cursing. And so Balaam says once again, "I can only say what God tells me to say." And so he goes up, and a little later he tries a second time. He goes up and he tries to speak over the Israelites and to say whatever the king wants him to say, to curse them. And he opens his mouth, and nothing but blessing will come out. Nothing but good things will come out for them. And when he's done, he backs up. King's mad again. He tries a third time, and once again, nothing but blessing will come out. Nothing but good things for the people of Israel will come out. And so finally he backs up and says, that's what it is. I can't say anything that God doesn't tell me to say. Good luck. And the king is ticked at him. He says, you won't receive a dime from me. You'll get nothing from this. You're supposed to curse them for me. I hired you to come here to curse them for me. Instead, you've had nothing but good to say about them, nothing but blessings to pronounce over them. Get out. I got nothing for you. And then Balaam all of a sudden starts spouting out again. He starts giving other prophecies. And this time it's about how Moab is about to be wiped out, and the king is going to be killed, and how terrible things are about to be for Moab, and then for this other people that are in Israel's way, and then this other people, and all these things that are about to happen to all these nations because they're all going to be opposing Israel. And so this seems like a really weird aside, right? I mean, now this is the 3rd consecutive book, starting with Exodus, where we have been dealing with what's going on among the people of Israel. They're in slavery. God leads them out of slavery across the desert. They come to Mount Sinai. He gives them the commandments and gives them the covenant there, gives them instructions for building the tabernacle. They rebel against him there, but God gives them a second chance. Then in Leviticus, we have all the laws and everything that they're supposed to do within the nation, and how they're supposed to handle life in the tabernacle, and how they're supposed to handle worship. And then we come to Numbers, and it's how many people are in Israel, how many people are, fighting men are available. Then their travels through the wilderness, and their rebellion, and all the things, the ways that they keep messing up over and over again. And even Moses screws up and rebels against God. All of this failure and all this stuff. And then all of a sudden we have we've been 3 books now in Israel, in the camp, pretty much only concerned with what's happening in Israel. And then all of a sudden there's this random story about this Moabite king hiring this weird prophet guy and a talking donkey and a homicidal angel and trying to curse and can't curse. And what is the story, and why is it here? This interestingly has been a very important and encouraging story for the people of Israel over a long time period. And the purpose, the understanding is, we've been watching Israel fail over and over and over again and deal with the consequences. And you see those stories over and over and over again, you got to think, eventually God's just going to snap and they're going to be gone. God's going to run out of patience with them, and that's going to be it. But we get this side story, and we find that there are these other groups, there are these other people that are conspiring against Israel, And while God is handing out consequences down in the valley, in the camp, God is also up on the mountain speaking through this prophet, keeping anybody from being willing to attack them. God is protecting them and preserving them even while punishing them for their rebellion and their sin. And so even though they're having to deal with all the consequences of their actions down in the camp, God is being faithful through this talking donkey and this pagan prophet. As an aside, if you think it's pretty amazing that God speaks through a donkey in this story, God speaks through the mouth of an ass in this story, you can come to my church and you can see that every Sunday. God speaking through the mouth of an ass. It'll take you a minute to get that, and then you'll realize, yes, I did just call myself an ass. So this story is all there to show God is faithful no matter what Israel does. Even if he is giving them consequences after consequences, he's still faithful. And so that kind of wraps up most of the movement, and then there's a couple of other stories at the end, a couple other deals. One of them is very interesting, that there are these two young women that come to Moses and ask for judgment on inheritance because their father has died and has no sons. And the tradition in most nations at the time would have been that if the father dies and has no sons, even if he has daughters, the land and the property would go to a near family member, somebody else that had sons, because only men were going to inherit land. And so the kind of assumption would be that the land would pass to a near family member. But these two daughters come, the daughters of this man that has died, come and ask for Moses' judgment, and Moses tells them, goes and inquires of God, and God says, let them inherit. Let the sons will inherit first, but if there are no sons, the daughters will inherit. And then if there are no daughters, it can go out to further and further out members of the community. But there is a law now that within Israel, daughters can inherit. Sons inherit first, but if there are no sons, women can inherit and own land. And so that at this time period would have been extremely odd and very unusual. And then also, the story kind of ends with them coming up to the mountain that God had told Moses about after he rebelled. And they come to this mountain, and God says, you're going to go up on this mountain, and you're going to hand over leadership of the people to Joshua, the other one of those spies up there. Joshua, the son of Nun, he's going to lead the people into the promised land. You're going to speak to them this one last time, and you're going to die. And they come to the mountain, and the speech that Moses is about to give, his kind of last speech to the people, is the whole book of Deuteronomy. So basically the whole book of Deuteronomy is this final speech that Moses is giving to the people before he hands leadership over to Joshua and dies on the mountain. And so we'll finish up with Deuteronomy and this final speech of Moses on Friday, and then we'll see the entering the promised land on Monday. Don't go yet, I got a test for you. Yeah, you have to